Have you ever heard of the show 1000 Ways to Die? Well, if you take a look at the 300,000 years of human history behind us, you'll quickly realize that 1,000 is barely scratching the surface. 1,000,000 would be closer to the truth, and even that might not cover all the bizarre, brutal, and downright terrifying ways people have died over the ages. Throughout the centuries, humans have faced some incredibly painful ends, some so horrific that others seem like a walk in the park by comparison. Fortunately, thanks to technology and overall progress, most of those gruesome outcomes are far less common today than they used to be. Because honestly, compared to now, the ancient world was a truly brutal place. We can only imagine the kind of harrowing situations our ancestors had to endure. Well, maybe we don't have to imagine too much. Every now and then, researchers get lucky. Not so lucky for the poor soul involved, but lucky for science. They stumble upon first-hand evidence of the catastrophic injuries people once suffered. And believe it or not, some of them even survived. But the first case we're going to look at, yeah, that one's definitely not for the faint of heart. Not every story of horrific injury ends in tragedy, and this next case is proof of that. Sometimes ancient humans didn't just survive traumatic wounds, they actually managed to carry on afterward. The best example of this is the oldest known amputation in the world, which dates back 31,000 years. For a long time, researchers already knew that amputations predated modern medicine, but the oldest case on record was only about 7,000 years old, a Neolithic farmer from Europe. So you can imagine the excitement in 2020 when a group of scientists stumbled upon something far older in Borneo and with signs of a successful amputation. The individual at the center of this discovery was found in the Leng Tabo cave. What immediately stood out was that their left leg and foot were missing. At first, some assumed the person had lost them in a fatal accident. But no, the researchers noticed something remarkable. The wound was incredibly clean, had healed perfectly, and clearly looked intentional. On top of that, the remaining part of the leg was underdeveloped, about the size of a child's, even though the skeleton belonged to a young adult. All signs pointed to the amputation happening during childhood. Now keep in mind, this happened 30,000 years ago. No painkillers, no anesthesia, no sterile operating rooms. Most likely, someone used a sharp stone tool to make the cut, and somehow that prehistoric surgeon managed to avoid the major veins, arteries, nerves, and tissues without causing fatal damage. But the most incredible part? They kept the area free from infection, something that's still a challenge even today. Modern studies show that up to 40% of major amputations result in infection, and this one was a total success. Not only did the person survive, they made it to adulthood and lived into their 20s, dying from something completely unrelated to the amputation, though we still don't know exactly what. So the big question is, why did they need the amputation in the first place? One theory has to do with the environment they lived in. The cave is surrounded by rugged terrain, massive rocks, steep cliffs, and treacherous slopes. Maybe they took a bad fall or had their leg crushed by a boulder, leaving it so badly damaged that cutting it off was the only option. Although they're believed to have lived nearly a decade after the procedure, life couldn't have been easy. Just imagine navigating those mountains with only one leg. They must have relied heavily on others to survive, giving us one of the earliest signs of human compassion in history. When we think of the plague today, our minds usually jump to historical disasters like the plague of Justinian or the Black Death. But what most people don't realize is that the story of this deadly disease goes back thousands of years, long before cities, kingdoms, or written records. And that's where our unfortunate hunter-gatherer from Latvia comes in. According to recent studies, he was the first known victim of the plague, or at least the earliest one for which we have physical evidence. This man lived about 5,000 years ago, and he was only around 20 years old when he died. What makes his story truly tragic isn't just how young he was, but how he likely met his end, from something as small and seemingly harmless as a rodent bite. Something we might treat today with a dab of antiseptic and a bandage was, for him, a death sentence. That tiny wound became the entry point for Yersinia pestis, the bacteria that would later become synonymous with mass death. But here's the twist. At that point in time, the plague hadn't yet evolved into the efficient killer it would one day become. DNA studies of this man's remains revealed that the strain that infected him was an early version, less contagious than the ones that would later sweep through entire continents. Still, that doesn't mean it was any less deadly for him. Depending on how the disease affected his body, his final days may have been nothing short of a nightmare. Although we can't know for sure how the illness presented itself in his case, the way the bacteria was distributed in his remains suggests it might have been the septicemic form, the deadliest type. That would mean he likely died in extreme fever and unbearable pain, possibly even with parts of his skin turning black before his organs began to fail. What's most striking about this case isn't just how he died, but the fact that he was only the beginning. The plague didn't end with him. Over time, this same bacterium would evolve and, thousands of years later, go on to devastate entire civilizations, wiping out over 100 million people. Could he have been the patient zero of one of the deadliest diseases in human history? Probably not. But his remains are the earliest solid evidence we have that Yersinia pestis was already among us long before the major outbreaks swept through Europe, Asia, and Africa. Today, modern medicine shields us from many of the dangers our ancestors once faced. It's easy to forget that something as microscopic as a single bacterium has been stalking humanity for millennia. And if history has taught us anything, it's that nature always has an ace up its sleeve. Now let's dive into a story with no happy ending, one where no one made it out alive to tell the tale. Sadly, this kind of death is still something that could happen today. Yes, we're talking about a shark attack, but not just any shark attack. This was the first confirmed shark attack in human history, a title no one in their right mind would want to claim. The victim was a hunter-gatherer from Japan who lived 3,400 years ago, and he's now known simply as Tsukumo 24. The discovery was made in 2021 near the coast of Japan's Seto Inland Sea. There, researchers unearthed a male skeleton in a truly grim condition. His body was covered in deep lacerations on his arms, chest, abdomen, even his hands. At first, the scientists were stunned. The wounds were so severe that they had actually scarred the bones, and they looked more like the work of a metal weapon than that of an animal or primitive tool. But then came the real shocker. This wasn't just a case of a few cuts or even a dozen. This man had over 500 injuries. In fact, the final count was 790. What made the case even more puzzling was that this individual belonged to the Jomon culture, a society that didn't use metal tools. That ruled out the idea of an ancient sword-wielding murderer. So the researchers went back to study the wounds more closely and noticed a crucial detail. The cuts were V-shaped, just like the bite marks seen in modern shark attacks. Combined with the fact that the skeleton was found on an archipelago, the evidence pointed to either a tiger shark or a great white. And this wasn't just any attack, it was a bloodbath. The man's chest and abdomen were torn apart, his ribs fractured, and to top it off, he had multiple amputations. Both feet were gone, as well as his left hand. Those missing limbs revealed something chilling. The man had been alive when the attack began. He likely tried to defend himself with his hands and feet, and the shark, without hesitation, ripped them off. That ruled out the idea of scavenging after death. This was a full-blown vicious attack, which raises another question. Why did the shark go after him? The deepest bites were on his left leg, which suggests a surprise attack. He probably never saw it coming. But here's the twist. The man wasn't found out at sea or in some ancient shoreline. He was buried in a traditional grave, and his body showed no signs of having drifted in the water. That means he wasn't alone when it happened. Given that the Jomon people were skilled fishers, the most likely scenario is that a group went out in a boat to fish. At some point, this man either jumped in to spear a fish or reached into the water to collect a catch, without realizing that blood in the water had attracted a shark. The predator didn't hesitate. It attacked ferociously. His companions must have rushed to pull him back into the boat, but by then, it was too late. All they could do was bring his body back to shore and give him a proper burial. If you're planning a trip to Japan, don't worry, sharks are still around, but things were much riskier back then. Archaeologists have found multiple fossilized shark teeth from that era, suggesting shark populations were much larger, so it's likely that attacks were more common back then than they are today. Not as sudden and brutal as the previous case, but certainly much stranger, this incident took place on the other side of the world and introduces us to the only known prehistoric Homo sapiens to end up trapped in a tar pit. We're talking about the La Brea woman. In case you didn't know, Los Angeles is home to the famous La Brea tar pits, a still active paleontological site that has been a death trap for animals for tens of thousands of years. Creatures stuck in the sticky tar would attract unsuspecting predators, who would also end up doomed. This site is thought to be around 50,000 years old, and over time, paleontologists have pulled thousands of iconic Ice Age specimens from it. Dire wolves, ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, American lions, mammoths, mastodons. And then, among all those animals, they found a primate. Well, a female primate, to be exact. The La Brea woman is a well-preserved skeleton, including a skull, jaw, and other body parts. It's estimated she was between 18 and 30 years old, stood about 1.5 meters tall, and lived around 10,000 years ago. Her teeth suggest she mainly ate food ground with stone tools, but that's not the mystery. The real question is, how did she end up in a tar pit? See, that's the weird part. Paleo Indians were well aware that these pits were dangerous and knew to stay away. So researchers began to suspect that someone gave her a deadly push. A closer look revealed unsettling clues. Her jaw was broken, her skull had a fracture, and a small hole suggesting a strong blow. Not from an animal, but from another human. According to experts, this wasn't an accident. If that's true, the La Brea woman would be the oldest known murder victim in what is now Los Angeles. There's still a lot of debate about who she was and what happened. Some evidence suggests she may have been part of the Chumash people, but we don't know why she was attacked. Was it personal? A conflict within her group? Or was it an enemy raid over territory and resources? Her injuries were most likely fatal for the medicine of her time, but it's still unclear whether she died first and was then thrown into the pit, or if she was still alive when she was cast into the tar and slowly suffocated. Either way, this story has the feel of a prehistoric crime scene, and one we'll probably never fully solve. Now let me ask you something. Would you rather die from a blow to the head or by drowning? Tough choice, right? But for one poor soul, the answer was clear. He became the first known modern human to die by drowning. And here's the wild part. It happened in one of the driest places on Earth, the Atacama Desert. This unforgiving landscape lies in Chile and is said to be the oldest desert in the world. The man lived about 500 years ago during the Neolithic period. His body was found inside a circular stone structure surrounded by seashells, which made sense. He lived near the coast where the ocean was close, though not in the way he'd have liked. At first, scientists were puzzled. He wasn't old, around 35 to 45, and there were no obvious signs of trauma or disease. But since he lived near the ocean and was buried with so many shells, researchers considered the possibility that he drowned. Now, how the heck do you confirm a person drowned over 5,000 years ago just from their bones? Turns out the key lies in something called diatoms, microscopic algae. And bingo! They found diatoms in his skeleton, which confirmed he had indeed drowned. Here's the creepy part. Diatoms only reach your bones if you inhale water. When that happens, your lungs burst, seawater enters your bloodstream, and eventually reaches your bone marrow, carrying those tiny algae with it. A brutal end, especially for someone who already had a hard life. His skeleton showed signs of severe arthritis, likely from years of crouching to collect shells. His legs were worn down, and his arms and shoulders were in bad shape, pointing to a life full of swimming, rowing, and spear throwing, typical of someone from a coastal community. On top of that, he had iron deficiency, possibly caused by a tapeworm infection from eating undercooked fish. And to make things even sadder, he didn't die alone. His body was found alongside 3 others, a man, an adult woman, and a baby. Radiocarbon dating revealed they all died at the same time. So what happened? Well, they lived in a highly seismic area. The initial theory was that a tsunami triggered by an earthquake took them all, but here's the weird thing. The other 3 skeletons didn't have diatoms, which means, unlike our main subject, they didn't drown. So the tsunami theory doesn't quite hold up. The leading hypothesis now is that this man accidentally drowned, possibly while diving for food, while the others died from other causes at the same time and in the same area. After all, the Atacama Desert was, and still is, a punishing place to survive. Blistering heat, freezing nights, and a dryness that sucks the life right out of you. Around 2,400 years ago, in the lowlands of Jutland, Denmark, a man met his end in a treacherous bog. His body, discovered in 1950, became one of the most remarkable archaeological finds ever. It was the first known death in quicksand-like conditions. The Toland Man, a man in his 30s or 40s, preserved by the acidic peat. His skin, hair, and even the leather cord around his neck remained intact, defying the passage of time. At first, experts thought he died by accident, maybe while gathering resources, but analysis revealed a chilling truth. He hadn't fallen into the bog. He'd been hanged and then placed there. A blow to the head suggested he was stunned before the execution. Evidence pointed to a ritual sacrifice, a practice common in Iron Age Northern Europe. These peat bogs were sacred, used for offerings to the gods. Weapons, precious items, and human bodies were placed in the wetlands in hopes of protection or forgiveness. It's believed the Toland Man was one such offering. His last meal? A simple porridge made of grains and wild seeds. Nothing like a feast, suggesting he wasn't honored, but rather disposed of. This has led scholars to debate whether he was a willing sacrifice, a condemned criminal, or a scapegoat. Other bog bodies were found with personal items, like the Groball Man's bone comb. But Toland had nothing of the sort. Death in these places wasn't instant. If the noose didn't kill him immediately, he may have remained conscious as the bog slowly swallowed him whole. His agony would have been silent, the mud wrapping around him until all struggle ceased. Today, Denmark's peatlands have mostly been drained or turned into farmland, but in ancient times, they were both deadly traps and sacred altars. The Toland Man reminds us that in a world without modern technology, nature and belief could create endings just as dramatic and terrifying as this one. Back then, Earth was a rough place, no matter where you lived. And just to make it worse, sometimes we humans made life even more painful than it already was. Take, for example, this young person, boy or girl, we're not sure, or any of the other 38 humans found in France with holes in their skulls. No, this isn't the scene of a mass murder or a battlefield. It was actually a pretty grim form of surgery known as trepanation. Yep, just like it sounds, it involved drilling a hole into your head, and it was probably one of the earliest widespread surgeries among Homo sapiens. The site dates back to 6500 BCE in France, making it one of the oldest known examples of trepanation, if not the oldest. But it wasn't an isolated case. Multiple archaeological sites have shown evidence of this intense procedure, leaving us with some truly brutal fossil records. Some studies even suggest that up to 10% of Neolithic people went through this thing. I hesitate to call it a treatment. In the French case, that number jumps to a staggering 30 feet. With rates like that, you'd think it was safe, right? Well, it's not exactly. It was pretty much as awful as it sounds. Drilling a hole into your skull. Less than 40% of those skulls show signs of healing. That means more than 60% of them died, mostly from infections, blood loss, or, of course, brain damage if the surgeon went a little too deep. And even if you did survive, the recovery was anything but easy. It could take months for the hole to close, and in the meantime, you'd probably feel miserable. And don't forget the actual surgery, performed without any kind of pain relief or anesthesia. How did they even do this? It's believed they used sharpened stone knives or, in some cases, even sharp-edged seashells. And it wasn't limited to a certain age group. Trepanned skulls have been found from children to adults. So why on earth did they do it? Well, apparently for almost anything. Some believe it was spiritual. Others think it was used to treat epilepsy or relieve head injuries, especially common back then with no real medicine. So if you woke up in ancient times with a serious migraine, maybe keep that to yourself. What's shocking is that this practice stayed popular for a long time. In fact, we still do it today. Of course, now it's done with precision, anesthesia, and for very specific medical reasons, not like the wild old days. We've come a long way, especially in how we manage pain. What comes next might sound like ancient history, but the truth is, these kinds of stories haven't vanished completely. They come from a time when life was far more brutal and heartbreaking, mostly because technology just didn't exist. If you want a clear example, look no further than the Bog Girl of Uchter Moor, or as some call her, Mora. She was a young woman from the Iron Age, what archaeologists call a bog body, a human naturally mummified in a peat bog. And what's that? Well, a peat bog is a kind of wetland that builds up layers of organic matter like charcoal and decomposing plants. Over time, it creates an environment that can preserve human bodies like time capsules. Mora was discovered in the year 2000. At first, the workers who found her thought she might be a modern girl who'd gone missing decades earlier after a night out at a club. But after some tests, it became clear. This was no recent victim. It was a skeleton over 1,000 years old, belonging to a young woman who'd lived in Iron Age Germany. Barely 17 to 19 years old, she had already endured more pain in her short life than most of us will in a lifetime. Every inch of her body bore signs of suffering. Researchers concluded she must have lived a life of grueling physical labor, probably hauling water jugs and making her way through thick, marshy bogs. And that was just the beginning. Her skull showed not one, but two major fractures, serious head injuries that, incredibly, had healed over time. These could have been from attacks, maybe by outsiders, or even from people in her own community. Skull trauma and violence were more common back then, so it's not surprising. But even though she survived, she likely suffered from chronic headaches and possibly neurological issues that made daily life miserable. Oh, and she also had a benign tumor at the base of her skull. That could have made her headaches even worse. On top of that, it caused spinal curvature, which gave her back pain. Her legs also showed signs of chronic inflammation, so severe that it literally changed the shape of her bones. It was like her own body was working against her, and her environment didn't help either. Evidence shows she likely got sick every winter, and as a child, she suffered from chronic malnutrition, which showed up in her deformed bone structure. In short, just existing was a daily struggle. Surviving? Even harder. She didn't even make it to the average life expectancy of the time, which hovered around 26 years. We don't know exactly what caused her death. Thankfully, there are no obvious signs of violent trauma, so murder seems unlikely. The most accepted theory is that she suffered some sort of unusual accident. But there's a mystery. She was found alone, without clothing or any personal belongings. That suggests someone may have moved her body before placing it in the bog. Why? Why not bury her on solid ground? Were they trying to hide something? Or maybe it was some ritual we still don't understand. And as if her suffering in life wasn't enough, even in death, she found no peace. When they found her in 2000, it was completely by accident. An excavator tore through the peat and shattered her body into over 100 pieces, which had to be painstakingly reassembled like a macabre jigsaw puzzle. So even now, thousands of years later, Mora's story remains just as haunting as it is fascinating. Thank goodness we no longer die in such wild, brutal ways. History is crazy. Sure, we've got our modern problems, but at least we don't have Stone Age surgeons or fatal surprises waiting every time we step outside.